You're listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickarse.com/episode 28.
Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Today's podcast is brought to you by audible.com. Get a free audiobook of your choice and a 30-day free trial by visiting borntokickarse.com/audible. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. To download your free audiobook today, go to borntokickarse.com/audible. Again, that's borntokickarse.com/audible for your free audiobook. Brad Beer is a physiotherapist, host of the Physical Performance Show podcast, and an Amazon best-selling author of You Can Run Pain-Free, a physio's 5-step guide to enjoying injury-free and faster running. Brad is also a successful marathon runner and former Olympic distance Australian Triathlon Champion. In this interview, we talk about running injuries, how to run pain-free, as well as the importance of hip stability. Enjoy the interview. G'day, Brad Beer. Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Matt, thanks so much for having me along.
Yep, that's no worries. Now, you are a physiotherapist. You're an Amazon best-selling author. You are a podcaster. You're the host of a podcast called the Physical Performance Show, which is it's a great podcast, I've got to say. And you're also the founder of a company called Pogo Physio. And I believe you've got a new child, a 1-month-old. Was it a girl?
Mate, beautiful little girl. That's
Yep.
right.
Yeah. So how do you manage your time? You got a lot of stuff that you're juggling and you're a runner as well. Definitely want to get into that. Do you sort of have any particular tips or how are you sort of juggling all these things currently in your life?
Matt, that's a great question. Time's one of these, non-redeemable assets, isn't it? People ask me regularly. I think when people see you juggling a few different balls in the air, and I don't really know other than I know what I'm like if I don't, get certain things done or expressed through who I am. So, if I'm not running or physically, exerting myself in some way, Matt, I'm less effective in other areas. So I think it becomes a matter of really a bit of self-awareness around how you can be at your best, Matt. And for me, I realize I can give my best to, my world when I am physically in some good shape. And I think naturally I am probably on, there's that anxiety or stress spectrum. And I think I tend towards more anxiety than stress. So I find that the physical exertion, Matt, is so important for me and just being at my best in all endeavours of life. But then, mate, in terms of the, our second child that's arriving on the scene who may make a guest appearance in the background there. That's really, just been another layer where it's like, wow, the responsibilities just keep getting added. So I don't actually have any textbook answer. I'm sorry to disappoint you other than sort of, I guess, focusing on, the things that, you feel like you need to get done to be your best.
Yep. How's the sleep deprivation going?
Yeah, Matt, that's very real, as any new parent would attest to. And I think it's making peace with the fact that it's just for seasons and being our second now, we realise that the days are long and the years are short. So, it's a matter of just sort of hanging in there and realising that it does start to develop into a bit more of a routine. And I think that's a bit like, operating a business or anything else. There's certain seasons where there might be a bit less sleep, but it's not a trophy. It's just the reality.
Yeah, that's it. You're sort of like, I know with my daughter when she came along, you sort of draw on the, the late teen, early 20s nightclub era, the lack of sleep and you're just tired all the time. You sort of draw back on that.
Yeah, but, you somehow find another gear. It's just, I think it's just built into us an extra level of reserve when it needs to be, I reckon.
Now, you've been quite sporty, and was triathlons your main sport that you participated in growing up?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. I grew up pretty much just wanting to be Brad Bevan, a former Australian sort of well-known triathlete through the 90s there. It was pretty much my ambition, be Brad Bevan and become a professional triathlete. So that was my number one career goal.
And what were you sort of mainly focusing on was it the Olympic distance?
Yeah, well, Matt, I took to triathlon at 11 years of age, and so that was 1991. So the triathlon scene was, different, less structured, and I guess there was less steps in the career pathway for juniors at that stage. So the biggest race around my local town of Grafton was the Grafton Triathlon, and that was a 1K swim, 30K ride, 8K run. So I remember taking that one on at 11. And off the back of that, spent most of the time, Matt, racing sort of state and national schoolboy championship races more around the sprint distance, 750, 25. But in amongst that, I had a few Olympic distance outings and crashed out at 19, on the road to what was hopefully my first World Juniors appearance for Olympic distance. But there wasn't the sort of development pathways back then they have for juniors now. So it was more of the shorter stuff, mate.
Now, you mentioned you crashed out. I remember reading through your website, bradbeer.com.au. What actually happened there? Did that sort of derail the path that you're on with triathlons?
Yeah, it's certainly, in some ways looking back, it was kind of the beginning of the end, in the sense that, up to that point I was competitive as a junior at sort of national level. And that race was in particular the Australian Schoolboys Championships down at Penrith, going around the regatta centre down there at the 2000 Olympic Games rowing regatta. So this was a year before the Olympics were to be held. And I was riding into first place and went up the inside. It was a silly move. It was all, a 19-year-old, poor thinking in the heat of the moment, and locked handlebars with another competitor as the draft buster sort of moved off his line on the motorbike and came down heavily, and multiple injuries. Had a subarachnoid brain hemorrhage. It was a fairly heavy fall, obviously, and lots of loss of skin and fractures through my body. And unbeknownst to me, Matt, at the time, the impact of the road onto my kneecap had slammed my kneecap into the underlying sort of little bed that the kneecap sits on, called the trochlear groove, and so that had actually started, what would be a cartilage injury that would actually manifest itself in the next year, 1 to 5 years, really, with my attempts to get back to running with no success because of the pain in my knee. So ended up with a arthroscope and surgery and trying to sort of reconstruct that bit of cartilage in my knee. And so really that crash at 19 kind of put a pretty quick halt to the momentum I had going.
And at this point in your life, had you actually started your studies in, was it physiotherapy and exercise science? Or did that sort of come after?
That came after. That was sort of all happened around my final year of schooling. And, after the crash, I spent 6 months just, I remember the nurse coming to where I lived in Grafton to do my wounds daily, because the whole side of my body, back then we'd raced triathlons in good old budgie smugglers and a singlet, so there was no tri-suits. So I remember the nurse dressing my wounds, and off the back of that, I came up to the Gold Coast, which is now where I reside, and started university in 2000, Matt. So the seeds of becoming a physiotherapist had been planted through my junior triathlon years, and it was kind of my default. Well, if something doesn't work out with following triathlon through, I'll jump over and hopefully get into the physio program. So that was sort of the start of that in the year 2000.
And did you, like, after this that massive crash that you had, maybe the next sort of year or two after that, were you fairly active at all, or did you put your whole athletic career just like on the back burner?
Yeah, Matt, it was, probably one of the lowest, phases of, my life where, I realized looking back, my identity was 100% in my performance. So in my head, I was Brad Beer, the triathlete. So when it came to a crash in Holt, I really felt lost, and I've spoken, different times. I was, I didn't see a point in really carrying on. I was suicidal at one point, looking back, clinically depressed. And so, any attempt to run or do any sort of training was pretty short-lived. And I remember having a conversation with my coach at the time, and he was great. He was preparing an athlete for the first outing of triathlon at the Olympic Games in Sydney. And he said, why don't you take a year out, focus on your studies, get your head down in your degree and come back after a year. So I took Bill, my coach's advice, and 1 year, Matt, turned into, incidentally, 12 years before I returned to triathlon, and university studies took hold, and, I made some attempts to run, but my knee was just too sore. So I jumped right in head first to as much surfing as I could and hitting the gym room, mate. So trying to get big biceps as the 20-year-olds, often do. But I was pretty miserable, mate, I have to say, in terms of my physical ability. My body's made to do the endurance sports, and so when I couldn't do that, I really was just not myself.
Did you sort of find throughout uni, the stuff that you were learning, the physique and, how things hang together and mesh, from a physiological point of view, were you sort of applying what you were learning to yourself in terms of trying to, like diagnose and heal yourself through what you were learning in uni? Were you sort of doing that?
Yeah, definitely, Matt. I mean, in the physiotherapy degree, I went through Griffith University. A lot of the more practical bits that, came in the later part of the degree. And, I was absolutely trying to, put it all into the construct of my own experiences. And I think a lot of therapists do, they go into a field because they've worked through something themselves and they realize they have something to offer to help others. So, mate, that was certainly my journey. I was very resourceful in researching everything about knees and different options, and everything in the end led to working with a great orthopedic surgeon here on the Gold Coast who, had an interesting surprise when he went in and arthroscoped it and, found a big, what was 2.5 centimetre split up this trochlear groove with the cartilage lifting up either side and fluid under the bone. And, and he was kind of like, no wonder you'd had a lot of pain. So it was more or less not present on the MRI. So it was I was relieved when he found something, Matt, because I was at the point of like, I've tried everything. This is just not breaking through. I can't believe I can't even get down the rocks to go for a surf, at a local break here called Stradbroke Island to paddle across the seaway. And I remember feeling like an all-time low where I'm like, okay, I've let go of running. I've let go of triathlon. And now it's starting to affect just a basic surf. And I'm 23, 24. What am I going to be like in the future? So off I went to surgery, and I was relieved when the surgeon found something.
And what about the recovery post surgery? Did that take a long time to get back on your feet, so to speak? Like in terms of not only recovering from the actual operation, but to slowly kickstart, strength training and running again.
Yeah, it was certainly running was a long way off, Matt. Funnily enough, I think 2 days later after my surgery, I was straight back at a university placement here at the Gold Coast Hospital, in the old Gold Coast Hospital building. And so I was following my supervisor up and down the stairs. She was a fit lady, and so she just wanted to take the stairs and not the lift. So I'm trudging up and down the stairs with a fairly swollen, sore knee. So I was back on my feet quick. But then, Matt, as for running, I actually in my well-meaning, terrific surgeon's advice, I still work closely with him in helping other people recover from knee surgeries. But, it was like, you'll be right, Brad, just don't really go back or try and go back to running. And I didn't set out to prove the surgeon wrong. I have the utmost respect for him. I started my physio practice and was really time poor, but needing to do something fitness-wise, and just started to do some small runs again. And, one in particular, when I was on vacation with my wife and I went out for a run and did 8Ks and there was no pain, and I thought that's too good to be true. So thought, I'm a bit of an all or nothing personality, Matt. I thought, right, 8Ks successful. I'm going to do the longest run I've ever done. I'm going to do a 30K run. So it made no sense. No physio hat on at this point. So off I went, and no pain off the back of that. And I started to think maybe I could run a marathon. And the funny thing is, I never had an interest in running marathons. Always thought marathoners were crazy as a junior triathlete, and used to hate the run as a junior triathlete. So it was my weakest leg. So funny where life leads you.
You are a pretty good marathon runner. I saw your best time, what was it, 2:46?
Yeah, mate, that's a couple of years ago in Melbourne. And I've never, thank you, that's nice. I mean, I'm well aware of where I'm in the world marathon pecking order, but I'd like to one day convert, sort of what I run for halves to a marathon, and so that still eludes me. But I'll keep chasing that. You need a goal out in front, don't you?
Now I want to just talk about so you, like, if we sort of fast forward a bit, you launched your business, Pogo Physio, which is located in Mermaid Beach, is it, on the Gold Coast?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Mermaid Waters. So, yeah, no, it's this is sort of the heart of the middle of the Gold Coast, and launched the practice more or less. It was within 4 months of graduating. I'd started a job, and I was working with a physiotherapist that I really respected. And he was in a partnership with a partner, and they were, a chalk and cheese type partnership. And I found that dynamic really challenging as a graduate stepping into that. So, I was actually quite miserable in that workplace. So I gave notice and was happy because I wasn't no longer in that workplace of tension, but unhappy because I no longer had a job. So off I went and started a practice, Matt, which was, back then it was viewed upon as, you don't really do that as a graduate, start a practice. But Matt, it was either that or leave the industry. And I really felt like I had a vision of how I believe physiotherapy could be offered. And so I was quite passionate about, starting the business.
So with physiotherapists, I'm guessing is it sort of like you have your general physiotherapists who can help with pretty much everything, but for yourself, did you sort of specialize in running injuries and running rehab? Was that sort of did you sort of have a particular focus? Is that sort of where your specialty lies?
Yeah, Matt, it's funny how careers evolve. You're right. There's, general private practice. That's the world I operate in. I was always attracted to that going through university, because that to me was what physiotherapy was. That's what I'd been at most weeks as a junior triathlete. And so upon graduating, my actual biggest passion at that point, Matt, was back pain. I'd actually had a disc injury through my, weightlifting career, if you like, pushing weights around in the uni gym. And that really knocked me around and was sort of superimposed on top of the knee. And when I graduated, I experienced the void of what I felt was good patient-directed care for lower backs. So actually my big passion, that was not running related. It was almost like I tried to get away from that because of the pain of not being able to fulfill what I thought I had in terms of that endurance aspect. So it was almost like I'd shut that out looking back in reflection, and thought, right, I'm going to go over to a new leaf and focus on back pain. So when the practice started, it was called My Back's Physio, and my vision was just to only ever treat back pain. But the first patient had a sore calf, and so I could help her, so I took her through. So the vision was blurred from the first patient. And then, Matt, over the years, that's ensued, the 10 years of practice, I returned to running, and just knowing that so intuitively, and having worked and helped so many runners over the years, it led to me releasing a book a couple of years ago, and really now that's sort of my niched area. I still work with all sorts of patients and really enjoy still helping people with back pain, but certainly the bulk of my time is helping runners, discover their best running, staying injury free, and also endurance athletes, swimmers, surf lifesavers, triathletes. That's really my sweet spot.
That's good, because I've got a heap of questions for you regarding injuries and stuff like that.
Bring them on, Matt. Bring them on.
Yeah. Well, so I'm a runner. I'm guessing a lot of the stuff that I am going to sort of confess, if you like, a lot of listeners can probably relate to. So in regards to my running, I've only done running, like road running and also trail running. No gym work. Like in recent years, like I don't ever go to the gym. It's only running. Ranging from lunch runs, up to an hour. If I'm training for an ultra, it might be out on the trails for 7 hours or something like that. Yeah, no strength and conditioning, pretty much no cross training, in regards to swimming or cycling or any sort of gym work or anything like that. I don't do any sprint training, no speed work. I've had pretty much every injury under the sun. Plantar fasciitis, on and off for years. I think last year was the worst I'd ever had that. I actually had to get a cortisone shot in my foot.
For it.
Yeah, for that. I've had bone bruising, haven't had a stress fracture, Achilles injuries, over the years, lost toenails, every toenail multiple times, ITB issues. But the main one that I've sort of got at the moment, which forced me, like I was in this 100 miler last year, and I was forced to withdraw at about 130 Ks. The VMO muscle on my left side, just like near my left knee, that was, I guess, for months leading up to the run, it had been sort of playing up. Yeah, that basically forced me to withdraw from that event. I've had some time off and then recently gotten back into trail running.
Yep.
And that VMO muscle on my left knee has started to, there's been like a real dull ache that's starting to show its face again.
Right.
And I've always sort of had a feeling that it might be to do with my glutes or my hips or my pelvis, weaknesses in those particular areas.
Yep.
Like if someone came to you and said, I've got an issue with my VMO muscle, the vastus medialis oblique.
Yep.
How would you sort of diagnose that? Does that sort of indicate weakness in the glutes, or?
Where would I start? Yeah, well, Matt, first and foremost, the framework that I operate on and always have as a physiotherapist is this notion of diagnosis being determining prognosis. So the first and most foremost thing is to get an accurate diagnosis. And typically that can be broken down to a structural diagnosis. So what's in that area that can get sore, just first and foremost, and there's normally a few structures in every area of the body that could potentially become pain generating. And then it's a matter of, tying in the reporting patient's symptoms and story of how the conditions, respond in and the symptoms, in combining those two to get an accurate diagnosis. Oftentimes we will use imaging or scans, and I have a little saying that, the imaging isn't to necessarily clarify a diagnosis, but more to determine the prognosis based off the quantification of the injury. I really believe any therapist with a certificate on their wall should be able to diagnose injuries straight up and not rely on a scan to diagnose it. It's more about using the scan to determine the prognosis, the time that the athlete's looking at to recover and the degree of injury that allows the determination of that prognosis. But so given that, if that's the case, in that area you described, Matt, you described the VMO, there's a few structures in that area that can become or could become pain producing. And they would be the medial meniscus, what we call the pes anseri, which is Latin for duck's foot. And so there's a little bit just south of the knee joint where the adductors, the gracilis, and inside leg muscle, and the semimembranosus, a hamstring muscle, all joined together. And there's a little bursa around that can become a real acute source of pain. Then further up the leg, you do have that quadricep and vastus medialis, obliquus portion of that. You've also got the knee up there, the patellofemoral joint, the patella, that could become a source of pain. So to determine, for example, your pain and which structure it was, we'd need to do a good, thorough assessment. And it's interesting in physiotherapy, Matt, this can't be done in 15 minutes or 10 minutes. We take an hour with new clients and then a second hour off the back of that to make sure we get everything in place to start with before we race off with an intervention. So Matt, without obviously assessing you, I would be probably thinking that from what you described, you're 130 Ks into an ultra run, which is outstanding, mate, that it might have been more the pes anseri and bursa that was irritated. That VMO is quite a robust little stocky, type muscle. So it would be quite unusual for that to be the pathology. So once that diagnosis is clear, then, mate, we can move to, okay, going, great, well, there's the diagnosis. And around that, if you picture, a circle in the middle of the diagnosis and then a whole bunch of circles around that middle circle, and they're all varying sizes, then we want to identify, Matt, what are the major contributing factors that are driving that or have produced that injury? We need to identify those and then treat those. And oftentimes people would love the notion that there's just one thing. It was just my shoes, or it was just because I ran hills. And that would be really, Matt, straightforward, wouldn't it, for the patient and also the practitioner. But the reality is it's like a recipe. There's a combination of factors. And in running injuries, there's really what I've seen time and time again, which is why I sat down to pen the book. It's a pattern that I wanted people to understand, to give them the tools to be able to manage their body. There's really 5 key factors that drive the running injuries, and that's what I outline in the book, You Can Run Pain-Free.
And can we go through those 5 factors?
Absolutely. So the first, and I'll give the headlines, Matt, and if you see fit to want to unpack them, we certainly can, mate. But the first one's understanding or discovering the running body, which in short form is, how is your body built genetically? What will that mean for your running and your running future, and also your body maintenance efforts? And then also, are you run ready? So, are you stiff in bits, weak in bits, and tight in bits that won't be conducive to injury-free running? That's the first step, Matt. The second step's running with great technique. So how the body's moving. Obviously, there's some principles that, help runners to start to trend towards, better form when they run, or technique. The third step in the 5 steps is navigating the footwear maze. So getting the right shoes on your feet. And isn't that a minefield? The fourth is what I call the importance of hip stability. So making sure there's strong hip control muscles in place that will not only make you faster but reduce your injury risk. And then the fifth, Matt, is the one that tends to trip up all runners, including myself at times, and that's the power of rest. So that's that art and science of a training program, being controlled and disciplined and putting the brakes on at times and allowing enough rest.
Now, I want to sort of initially hit the 4th step, which is the importance of hip stability, because I've always, just through my own self-diagnosis and, doing my own research through Google and also visiting physios and doctors and, talking to other people and stuff, I've always just had an inkling in the back of my mind that a lot of my injuries, or pretty much all of my injuries, could potentially be a result of imbalances and weaknesses in my core and also my hips, pelvis and glute area. If like a patient came to you and, you did your diagnosis and you did all your tests and stuff, are there particular strengthening exercises that you get patients to do to try and strengthen their hips and get that area more stable?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the book, I reference 4 or 5 key strength exercises, and it's not that there's just a recipe, blanket recipe for every runner. The reality is that most runners, outside the professional ranks, Matt, they're time poor. They want results, and they want to be out there, running without injury. So I've tended to boil down the exercises to start with a lot of ones that I just know get results. They cut through the chafe of no one wants to do exercises and spend time getting down on the ground or whatever on things that don't get an effect. So I've really zeroed down the key exercises that help get the best effect for the runners. And, off the back of an assessment where we can identify, well, okay, if there's a deficit of hip stability, because that can be various muscles, which bits need to have the most attention, we can really prescribe the individual progressions and ongoing programs of strength work. But there are often a subset of really key ones that literally, Matt, any runner could start doing and they'd benefit from.
In the book, you've actually got a link to a page on your website which shows a number of videos that go through some of the the tests and some of the exercises. I might put that in the show notes.
Yeah,
for listeners.
Yeah, I think that would help listeners for sure.
Yeah, because I understand it's a bit hard to sort of describe, exercises when people are listening. Sometimes they need to actually see it.
Yep.
But I'll link to that in the show notes. In the book, you mention core strength and core stability and hip stability.
Yep.
Can you maybe talk about that, the differences between those, and just give a bit more insight into that?
Yeah, for sure, Matt. I mean, hip stability is what I reference in the book is a subset of core stability. So core stability, if you like, is the overarching term that encompasses what we all have in our heads as, that stability and strength through the midsection of our bodies. Oftentimes we realize that involves abdominal work and oblique work on the side and stability of the back, but we overlook the importance of the hip musculature in that. And the hip musculature, the key groups within the hips are the glute max, the one that we sit on, that we all kind of, realize is important. But what often gets forgotten is the deep hip external rotators. And I like to think of them as the rotator cuff of the hip. So they help to draw the hip joint back in the socket. And then there's also the side stuff muscles, which is the glute medius and glute minimus. So they're your 4 key muscles, if you like, and there's a whole little bunch of external rotators, but we just group them into one. I like, rather than break them down, we group them into the overall category of hip external rotators. So Matt, that's how hip stability relates to core stability. It's a subset. It's a section of overall core stability.
If people came to you and you got them to commit to doing some core strength exercises and hip stability exercises, and they were committed and they stuck to that over a number of weeks or even months.
Yep.
Or I'm guessing ongoing.
Yep.
It'd be an ongoing thing. Would those exercise, the strengthening of that particular part of the body, would that drastically reduce a lot of the common injuries that runners have, such as, ITB issues and, knee pain and Achilles injuries and stuff like that? Would it sort of drastically reduce a lot of the common injuries that runners get?
Excuse me. Absolutely, Matt. The encouraging thing for runners is you can make significant activation muscle changes within a fortnight, and then progress onto the endurance and strength that follows off the back of that. But Matt, I really can't recall ever seeing over the 10 years in private practice, in clinical practice, working with runners in the physiotherapy room, an episode where a deficit in hip stability or hip strength hasn't been one of the major contributing factors to their injury presentation. So if we were just talking about overcoming an injury like your cited Achilles tendon pain, you cannot neglect to look from the hip down. It's no good just looking at the foot in the local area. what's happening from the hip down. You need to consider the foot up as well. So you're spot on, Matt. It's got a place in pretty much any runner's injury minimisation, injury rehabilitation, or just seeking to run best physical performance running, exercises.
Another thing I wanted to ask was the term activation, muscle activation. What is that? What does that mean, like muscle activation or activating muscles?
Yeah, Matt, I like to just sort of make an analogy of a car battery. So when a car battery goes flat, what do you do to get your car going? You hopefully charge it up and, off you go. It's a bit like that with certain muscles in our body or bodies. We can become deactivated, if you like. It doesn't mean the muscle's forgotten what to do. It's just not fully firing. So things like sitting down a lot can start to knock out the deep hip external rotators, even parts of the glute max from compressing the muscle. So it's a bit, I make that analogy. It's like charging up the battery. Once they're activated, then you can move into strength, but you can't start strengthening something truly unless you've switched on the muscle. And also these muscles tend to be the deeper ones, Matt. So we're talking about ones normally close to the joints that are more of the stabilizing type roles versus the prime moving roles of the bigger muscle groups around the body.
Now, you mentioned, and it's also in the book as well, I think there were 3 phases. You've got muscle activation, and then once a particular muscle has been activated sufficiently, the next sort of phase is the muscle strengthening, and then after that, you sort of move on to the muscle endurance.
Yep.
How sort of long would each phase sort of take? Once you, let's just say you're focusing on activating the glutes, for example,
yep.
And someone was committed to, doing these exercises and strength work, how long would it take normally for the glutes to start firing and activating?
Yeah, Matt, excuse my croaky voice. It can be as little as 48 hours with some consistent effort. You can start to, really change the activation of a muscle. I today had a runner-up from Coffs Harbour yesterday. She drove up looking for some solutions for some persistent running injuries, and I saw this patient probably around mid-morning yesterday, being Thursday, and this morning they stayed overnight before they drove back to Coffs Harbour. It's about a 5-hour drive, and I saw her this morning, first patient through the doors, and overnight, Matt, and I encouraged her to go back to her hotel room and, get through these exercises 3 or 4 times, and there was already objective, measurable change in how these muscles were firing. So, it's not uncommon to be able to switch things on in a day or two, certainly within 2 weeks. But runners are often astounded when they see such positive change in as little as 2 weeks, which, I always, love to see, because the lights go on. They realize they can do this, and, that the task isn't so, overwhelming that's ahead of them.
With the actual strength phase, if you're building up strength in a particular muscle, like the glutes, for example, is there an average sort of time frame that someone could expect to see strengthening occurring in that particular muscle?
Yeah, great question.
Or is that like an ongoing thing as well?
That's a really good question. So if someone was rehabilitating or just looking to improve their strength for their running performance alone, then, it's like any sort of, which, Matt, you're an active guy. It's, 4 to 6 weeks of really getting some consistent effort where you start to see the best uptake and the quickest rate of change. So that's where you tend to get your great strength gains, 4 to 6 weeks of consistent effort. Then you can continue to make them, but you might get that 80% uplift in the first 6 weeks, and then the last 20% might take the next 3 or 4 months. But, at a certain point, runners then switch into this maintenance mindset where they've either fully rehabilitated their injury or they're happy with their performance of running. So they're like, right, what do I now need to do to maintain this and not drop backwards or develop an injury? So, they're increasing resistances on the exercise, or weights or repetitions might start to change as they go into that maintenance phase.
Have you ever used an electrical muscle stimulator?
Personally, Matt, I honestly can't recall a time using it outside of needing to learn about them in university. I'm a very manual therapist in terms of as a physio, and certainly our physiotherapy team's the same. So we really don't even use electronic equipment, but there's certainly roles for them in terms of training or giving a client or a patient some feedback on what they're doing activation wise, but they're not a big part of my practice.
Just want to talk about pelvic tilt.
Mm-hmm.
Like I sort of looked in the mirror like last night, before, doing a bit of research on this interview.
Yep.
And my pelvis, because I know there's sort of two main tilts. You've got the anterior, which is, I think, tilting forward, where the pelvis is sort of tilting forward, and then there's posterior, where the pelvis is tilting backwards.
Yep.
Looking in the mirror side on, I believe mine sort of looks as though it's tilting forward.
Yep.
Does that mean there's a weakness in my glutes?
Good question, and well done for being able to differentiate the anterior or the forwards tipping pelvis to the backwards tipping pelvis. And the easy way for listeners is, just put your hands on your hips and poke your bottom out, and you'll notice your hands drop towards the floor. That's that anterior or downwards tilt towards the floor. So Matt, what you've described, how are the glutes connected, is spot on. They are connected, but the cause more so of that forwards or downwards or anterior tilt is more going to be tight quads and hip flexors that pull on the front. And what that inadvertently does, which you just identified, is it gives you less ability to then use or activate the glutes at the back of your bottom.
Okay, yeah, because I have full-on real tight hip flexors.
Yep.
Like in my day job, I'm sitting behind a computer all day, and I went for a couple-hour run earlier on this week, just like a trail run, and my hip flexors were super tight.
Yep.
So to loosen that, is that sort of just stretching?
Yeah, there's certainly a gold standard stretch that I prescribe, Matt, for hip flexors and quads. And the nice thing is it's a one stretch that gets both areas, and that's kneeling up against a wall with the toes up the wall. And we can probably pop this in the show notes for listeners, Matt, but outside of any knee pathology where someone just can't get into that kneeling position, it's the gold standard way to stretch through the front of the hips, and holding for that for 1 to 2 minutes on each side can make an incredible difference, even in as little as a few days, to the length of the quads and the hip flexors, and therefore the position of the pelvis on standing, but also running. And most runners that I assess on the treadmill, Matt, do have that forwards dropping hip position, because as humans in today's society, we all sit so much, which shortens the hip flexors and often the quads.
So let's just say the hip flexors have been loosened up, and they're they're loose and they're free moving.
Yep.
To get your pelvis back to sort of like a neutral position, would the second part of that include, like, let's just say your hip flexors are loose? Would you then focus on the glutes to sort of bring the pelvis back into like a neutral position? Would that be the second thing?
Yeah, good question, Matt. The hip flexors and quad release themselves will position you to where you need to be, but then certainly adding on top of that, the glute work will just help maintain good pelvic, stability, if you like, or pelvic positioning for sure.
I've been thinking of getting a machine, like a gym machine, where you basically sort of lie on it and it's for your lower back. You sort of do like a reverse sit-up,
mm-hmm.
and that sort of focuses mainly on your glutes and your lower back. Would that type of machine be, those particular exercises be good?
So it's a reverse sit-up, as in you arch your back backwards, or?
As though you're lying on like a padded thing.
Yep.
that over your hips. Your legs and your hips are sort of horizontal to the ground, and then from your hips upwards are sort of dangling down on the ground, and then you're sort of lifting your upper body upwards.
Oh, yep, I follow. And would that be helpful for your hip?
Yeah, lower back and hips and glutes.
Yeah, it's certainly one way. The only consideration is if you're tight in your hip flexors and quads, that could put, Matt, some adverse load across your lower back. So if we were trying to really focus on, specific muscles, I'd probably lean towards more body weight type exercises, some side bridging progressions and lower back type progressions. And it's interesting, I don't actually prescribe a lot of rectus abdominis work in the physiotherapy setting. I find most people are quite good through their rectus abdominis muscles at the front of their stomach there. It's more the side stuff that's lacking. So if you picture a runner going from single leg to single leg, if there isn't that restraint on the side of the body, then that hip can just start to fall out to the side. So Matt, I often, it comes back to that, that concept of time. Runners want the biggest bang for their buck, and often that side stability is so much lacking more than the front abdominal muscles that they'd focus on that. So.
And do you sort of do these exercises yourself with your own training outside of work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the last thing I'd ever want to do is, write about how to do it, not do it myself. So this is a big part of my training program. I talk about in the first step of the book, understanding your running body. There's 3 types of peoples: flippies, floppies, and stiffies. And I'm a floppy, so that means I've got naturally more movement around my joints. So if I don't stabilize around my running body, then I'll end up with a whole lot more injury. So, Matt, I am in marathon preparation mode. I will be doing these exercises for 5 or 10 minutes every day and being as consistent as I need to be right up to an event. So it's just part of my routine.
And when do you sort of try and fit that in your day? Do you do it sort of first thing in the morning, or just randomly throughout the waking part of the day, or, after dinner that night? Do you sort of have a particular time of day that you try and follow these exercises?
Get them done
Yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, Matt, good question. I mean, pre-kids, our little ones, I could have said in the morning before I went for a run, but post-kids, it can be anywhere from getting home from the run through to in the evenings. I mean, before we jumped on this call, I actually knocked out a few sit-to-stands and a few other side planks and different things. So I'm now more of an opportunist. Wherever I can get a moment, I'll do them. And even if I'm not running, like I'm on a break at the moment, I'll, it's just part of my routine. And it also benefits, Matt, the health of my lower back. There's not a single person out there that if they stretch their quads and their hip flexors and then do some hip strengthening in addition to that, won't do their back a massive service in terms of reducing stiffness and pain. So for me, it's just about as much as, not having back pain for 7 or 8 years, Matt, I was more or less felt crippled by it at university. So it's got that double win for me. So it's a big part of my life. So, yeah.
Just want to get your take on stretching, static stretching. Like I know a lot of people, like I don't stretch at all.
Yep.
My hamstrings I'd probably... pound for pound, my hamstrings are just so tight.
Yep.
But, prior to going on runs and stuff, like I don't do any stretching at all.
Yep.
If I'm going on like a 2-hour run, for example, I won't go off flat chat. I'll sort of just warm up into it.
Yep.
But, I pretty much never do any stretching at all. What's your views on stretching?
Mate, this is a great question. I'm so pleased you asked it. There's still a lot of, confusion around where stretching. It's interesting, something so practical and simple, but where does it fit in? And I've been really encouraged by the response of people reading the book, You Can Run Pain Free, because once they work through the first step, understanding their running body, and they discover if they're a flippy, floppy, or stiffy, they discover what stretching then means to them. So as an example, Matt, as a floppy, so I've got naturally this movement around my joints. Generally, I am better served with running at my best and without injury by doing more of the strength and stability work. However, I can still get tight or pathologically tight, if you like, in certain muscle groups. And for me, that's often my, my hamstrings or quads. So in terms of stretching before you go and run, I wouldn't waste your time doing it. And that's not to discredit anyone that's out there or a listener that's already doing it, just to redivert their time and energies. Instead, do a few activation exercises or drills. Start your run with a steady warm-up type pace, and then build from there as your best way of minimizing injury. There's been no link, and this is through the research with clinical reviews and trials, between stretching statically and minimizing injuries. There's a blog I wrote about it. If you're interested, we can get that up there for listeners, Matt. But in terms of stretching then for injury minimization and optimizing performance, if you are a flippy or a stiffy, so you've got less than normal movement around your joints, then you are someone that certainly does benefit from a lot more of that mobility type stretching approach. And so, you might be doing a lot more stretching than someone that's like myself that naturally has that movement around my joints that needs to be stabilized. And I guess the last point I'd say on the stretching too, Matt, is tight muscles are often weak muscles. A classic example in the running community is runners that come in with tight calves or recurring calf strains, and they'll come in and say, I just don't get it. I stretch these calves all the time, yet there's no breakthrough. I'm stretching them, I'm foam rollering them, and they're still tight. And when we assess the calf strength, Matt, it's often very low scale, and so they're pleasantly surprised and and happy when they get in and put some strength into the calves, and all of a sudden that tightness goes away. So tight muscles are often weak muscles. So actually assessing and finding out, well, where's the weakness that's driving that tightness, and fixing that is the better way to, address the tightness, and just continuously stretching these tight muscle groups, if that makes sense.
Now, you mentioned foam rolling. I absolutely hate the foam roller.
Yep.
Like, I've got one somewhere.
Yep.
It's probably covered in cobwebs.
Yep.
But, I find it so painful. Yeah, I just hate it.
Yep.
How beneficial is the foam rolling in terms of injury, recovering from injury and prevention? Is it just hype, or does it really work?
Mate, you've got some very good questions, and I'm excited to answer them, because I hope it will help clear up a lot of people's, sometimes wondering that they have themselves. Foam rollers is no doubt are very popular. I remember when they sort of started to become in vogue, and in the late 90s, I guess mid 90s even, and they've really taken off now. They're everywhere. They're part of a lot of athletes, programs. It's a bit like I often get asked, will this help or will that help? And my sort of default answer, Matt, is it won't hurt. So foam rollering is not going to hurt any runner. It can only potentially help, but it comes back to that use of your time. Is it going to give you a 5% improvement when there's something you could be doing that would give you 100% improvement of what you're trying to get done? An example being ITB friction syndrome. That's that pain on the outside of the knee, one of the top 6 common running injuries. Runners that develop that often, read or Google or hear say from a running colleague that what they need to do is get on the foam roller and roll their ITBs. And interestingly, that's one of the last things I would ever give to a runner with ITB friction syndrome, because it might make the outside of the leg feel better, not while you're on the roller, because that's normally not fun, as you alluded to, but it might make it feel a bit better when you get off it for a moment, but you're still not fixing the problem. What's driving that tightness? And it's normally found further up the chain, and that's weakness in the hips. And it's been interesting in recent weeks. I've seen a few therapists around the world start to express what I've sort of held as a belief as well, and that's that foam rollering might actually do more harm for irritated ITBs, because it has that compression effect where you jam the ITB onto the bone where it's already irritated. So for things like calves, tight quads, tight glutes, middle of the back, I'm a fan for sure, but I actually think there's other things that runners could do in time-constrained worlds that would actually give more runners a lot more help than just getting and rolling around on the roller.
I've also done, the Graston. Is it the Graston technique?
Yep.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the Chinese version is called Gua Sha.
Yeah.
I've sort of, jumped on YouTube and sort of gone do it yourself approach.
Yep.
Grab out the lube and
way you go.
And just sort of start scraping away.
Yeah.
That I've sort of gone down that path. I don't know if people don't know what the Graston technique is. Can you maybe give some insight into that?
Yeah, good question, Matt. I have to say it's not something that I've spent a lot of time looking at. The first time I'd heard about it was from a US triathlete who I was helping remotely with some of his Achilles tendon problems, and he was talking about the Graston technique. He'd had a lot of it, so I did jump online then and looked at it, and it's from what I gather, it's a sort of tool that's a bit like a butter knife, maybe a bit more vigorous, and you apply cream, and you sort of effectively what you're doing is breaking up some fascia / connective tissue, which can certainly be effective. I've never done the technique myself, purely for the reason that I haven't felt like there's been a void in the skills I've got to be able to do that with different ways. So I haven't really gone to look for anything specifically different. But I do know Australian physiotherapists that use it with great success. So once again, if it gets results, then I'm all for that.
Now, in your book, it's mentioned I'm just trying to find it. The hip down approach.
Yep.
And then there's also the foot up approach.
Yep.
We've sort of talked about glutes and, the hip area, glutes, pelvis, hip, that sort of area.
Yep.
With the foot up approach, what sort of exercises would you recommend for foot and ankle strength and lower limb strength and mobility?
Yeah, Matt, there's obviously a few headings there. I mean, the hip down, foot up approach is basically like if you've got a lower limb running injury, don't just look at the hip or don't just look at the foot. Consider that two-way street, what's happening from the hip down and what's happening from the foot up, to often load up that lower limb more. So that's the sort of concept. But then specifically, what would you do to, help with the foot or the shank, which is below the knee, with strength? One of my go-to prescriptive exercises, Matt, that I write about in You Can Run Pain Free is single leg calf raises. I have a little mantra, 30, which I've actually upped the number on in recent years. 50 single leg calf raises a day keeps the physio away. So many runners run around with quite weak calves, and that's often why they're running around with tight calves. So that's certainly one of the best little exercises, and that can be done just on a single leg, just coming up and down on a 1 second type count. And most
on a step, maybe?
No, just on the flat mat.
Okay, yep.
One finger on a wall or balancing on something. And most runners are startled when they do their test and they realise they can at best get 20 reps out. And yet, every time we push off as runners, we push off the big toe, and that propulsion largely comes from the calf. It's a big portion of that propulsive movement. So that's one great exercise. You've got things like, soleus strengthening as well, where you can go up against a wall and do a squat against the wall and have your feet underneath your knees, just doing that sort of wall squat hold position. And then Matt, simply come up on the toes and plantar flex the feet, and you just sort of imagine you're Michael Jackson in his sort of toe hold position, and you're just sustaining that for up to 30 seconds to a minute. And then, you've got a whole bunch of, things like the hip down work, which we've already addressed, like sit to stands or side bridges, or exercises like the fire hydrants and hip external rotators that, we can reference, as you said, through that blog post.
Just want to touch on barefoot running.
Yep.
What are your views on that for recovery, strengthening, and maybe alignment, getting the muscles realigned? Do you sort of do any barefoot running yourself, or what are your views on that? Let's just say someone goes for a trail run, and to maybe mix it up with maybe let's just say half hour of barefoot running around an oval or something like that. Do you do that yourself, or what are your views on that? Yeah,
Matt, barefoot running, obviously had a real boon in interest off the back of the very popular and great read, Born to Run. And certainly as a physiotherapist around that time, I saw a lot of runners throwing away their shoes and either getting the Vibram 5 fingers or, going barefoot. And the barefoot stuff's fine if that transition's done appropriately, but going from a traditional motion control shoe to nothing's just a recipe for a sore calf or a sore Achilles tendon. So what I like to sort of summarize in terms of my concept of barefoot running is you want to run like you don't have shoes on, but have shoes on. And if you really have, a penchant for getting rid of your shoes, then do so, but go slowly over time. But the reality is, Matt, most runners are, recreationally, they don't have time to do the work that would be required to transition appropriately to a pure barefoot approach without getting injured. But I do like to say to runners, hey, take your shoes off if you're at the beach or you're on a park and do a few laps with no shoes on and just feel your body move. I mean, you instantly change how you land with your foot being more under the center of your body mass. You tend to lean forwards more. So it's all off the back of getting more feedback because your feet are directly in contact with the ground. So I do like to encourage runners, hey, chuck your shoes off, but don't go and replace your 10K run that you would normally do with shoes without shoes and expect to, not end up in the physiotherapy room.
I've also seen in your book, I think there was mention of shockwave therapy for injuries. And what is that?
Yeah, Matt, that might have been, there's a lot of content that we put out. So I think that might have actually been maybe a blog post you might have come across, Matt. But shockwave therapy is just one of these other modalities, Matt, of trying to help certain recalcitrant conditions get better. So I personally don't perform shockwave therapy. We have a visiting podiatrist that does, and he's had some success with it. It's a form of stimulation which basically helps to regenerate some tissue healing, typically in fascias and tendons, where they can both be very slow at times to recover. So it's a modality for treatment, but it's not necessarily a rehabilitative in and of itself, if that makes sense. It's a bit like, massage or acupuncture or manipulation or mobilization. They're just modalities of the first part of an injured person's journey, which is pain relief. They're not necessarily just in and of themselves the answer. It's a combination of the right things to address the injury's original contributory factors.
Like maybe moving away from sort of the physiotherapy field, how important do you think diet is as well to, injury prevention and recovery?
Yeah, look, certainly, Matt, diet is, just a fundamental of good health in general. So in terms of injury recovery and prevention, I mean, one of the direct correlations is our frame weight. So we're all engineered to be a certain body weight. And if we're in surplus of that, even 5 kilos or 2 kilos or 10, 20, 30, the body's under a lot more strain. So, if our caloric intake's a little bit on the surplus side, then so's our frame weight. And, that'll add time to an injury rehabilitation because the body's got to work through extra strain that it hasn't been engineered to withhold. So that's an example of how diet does influence injury recovery. The other example is just nutrition. Healthy cells, the building blocks of our bodies, obviously mean healthy tissues and healthy recoveries.
I just got a couple more questions just before we wrap up. Just on success, how do you define success?
Gosh, Matt, now we're going deep, aren't we? Matt, success to me would be how close, I guess, we all come to fulfilling our purpose, our individual purposes in life. And for me, I personally have a strong faith, and for me, it's about, the end of my last breath, whenever that may be, being able to look back and feel like I walked a journey that was in accordance with, how I was put together, how I was engineered. I think as we go through life, we start to recognize our unique gifts that we have, which everyone has. And certainly in the more recent years, I've started to really just focus on those natural gifts that I have. I've got plenty of shortcomings. And I guess for me, it would be about looking back, and success would be, did I fulfill that, for me, God-given potential, that reason for being here? And did I have an impact on others' lives that, that I was called to have? And really anything short of that, or, not in alignment with that, to me wouldn't reflect success. So, yeah.
Just on advice, if you could make a phone call to the 20-year-old Brad Beer and give him some advice, what would you tell him? Yeah,
Matt, I would tell that younger version to, funnily enough, back myself more, to not look sideways. As I mentioned earlier on our conversation, I think through life I've actually been more of an anxious type personality. So even in my sporting days, I'd often worry more about what others were doing than what I was doing or needed to do myself for my performance. So, just to put the blinkers on and not get into the comparison game, but just, focus on what's before you immediately and not look sideways.
Now, just on books, aside from your book, You Can Run Pain Free, on your website, you do have a really good list of books that that you've called out, that you've sort of drawn upon. Is there a particular book that you could recommend other than your own book?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Matt, it's interesting on just my personal website. It's a work in progress. The books that I actually listed there were more, not sporting specific, were, I guess, a reading list that had more helped me in my personal development and my, my owning a business type career. But if I had to pick one book out of those, which is always a big ask, isn't it? When there's, books can impact you in so many ways. I would probably say the book there that's called Order in Your Private World, which is actually written by a pastor. I believe he was in England, and it's basically about living your life from the inside out. So, I think the subtitle in the book's about cultivating an inner victory so that you can be publicly effective. So I just recall reading the first few pages and chapters of that book, literally just in tears, feeling like I was just undone. And I've since gifted that book to multiple people in my world, and the feedback's tended to come back quite similar each time. It's like, wow, thank you, but geez, you gave me a bit of a 1-inch punch there. It knocked me for a 6, but it's what I needed.
Now, whereabouts can people find you online, and if they need, physio, to see a physio, sports physio, like yourself,
yep.
Whereabouts can they find you?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, my name's a little bit different with Beer as a surname. So, I mean, just typing in Brad Beer Physio will bring up the places that I inhabit online. The physiotherapy practice is Pogo Physio, so that's Pogo, Pogo Physio, and if listeners want to find that, they can obviously just dump that in the search engines as well. Social media-wise, Matt, my popular hangouts are Instagram, and I can just be found at Brad_Beer, BEER, and that's the same on Twitter. And then if there's listeners that really want some running information and running specific stuff, then I have a running Facebook page, which is just called running.physio. So running.physio, and I'm actually about to start a series of power hours where I get in there and just do some question and answers for people in that Facebook community. So they're my hangouts, mate.
Yeah, cool. I'll put all those in the show notes and a link to your book as well. That's a good domain you've got, running.physio. I was looking at that and I thought, you must have got in early to grab that one.
Yeah, well, that's just sort of second-level domains that are starting to pop their head up, and certainly have plans to build that out into something that I'm excited about that can start to serve the running community on a more, global level as opposed to my immediate, geography. Yeah. So, that's sort of a a bit of a landing page at the moment, but if anyone wants to jump on a list, they can there, where they get some updated content. But yeah, mate, that's a project for 2017 where we'll launch something on that website.
Yeah, cool. And you're also a podcaster. What's the name of your podcast?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's called the Physical Performance Show, and the theme of the show, Matt, is to get behind the lives of inspiring and the world's best physical performers. So, I catch up weekly with guests, everything from the next upcoming episode, the 19-year-old girl that scaled Mount Everest from Australia here recently, through to Tour de France cyclists and Paralympic athletes, and just inspiring people with their physical stories. And it's fun because you get to see, we all know the success because that's what we visibly see, but we don't get behind the curtain to actually often hear of the tales that underpin their success. So, mate, it's a weekly show, the Physical Performance Show. Yeah, no,
it's a great podcast. I've listened to a couple episodes. Is there anything that you sort of found with those guests that you've interviewed? Is there a common theme that is coming out from all these champion athletes that you've interviewed?
Yeah, mate, you have some terrific questions. And it's something, Matt, that I've been commenting to multiple people on of recent times about when they pass on feedback about the podcast. And you're spot on it. And I'm sure you get the same with your guests on your program, your show. And I guess the common themes I've seen so far, where I think 18, 19 episodes in, would be that the extra mile really matters, that none of these physical performers have achieved their success, whatever that looks like, through doing what everyone else does. They often talk about, when the other athletes were resting, I was doing extra work. A favourite story recently was my sporting hero growing up that I referenced earlier at the start of this call, Brad Bevan. And I was smiling when Brad Bevan was sharing the story, Matt, that, the drug testers would come during his career and he'd be on a plane that afternoon back to his hometown in North Queensland, and he would say, right, well, you come in for a run with me in your jeans and your thongs because this is my only opportunity for the day to get a run in. So, he'd take them off, whereas everyone else would sit and, comply with the drug test. And not that he wasn't complying, but he had his own way of getting things done. So there's always that extra mile that these top performers, put themselves through or seek out. And the other thing, which I find endlessly fascinating, Matt, would be that often they're quite a fair way into their visible success or their sporting careers or achievements when, then they talk about the moment they felt like they had arrived. One of the fun guests recently, Troy Bayliss, multiple world superbike champion, Troy spoke about the time that, he'd had multiple world victories at that stage and series wins, and it wasn't, I think in his early 30s or mid-30s when he stood up and he felt like he'd now truly arrived. So I think that sort of speaks to that notion that we can always see more for others than we ever see for ourselves. And so they'd be the common themes so far, Matt.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, I just want to say thanks again for coming on. I'll put all those links in the show notes. I'll also put a link to the video, those videos. I think it was in the book resources.
Yep.
Good luck with Pogo Physio and your podcast, and I guess we'll be in touch soon. And I'm definitely going to book in and see you. Get an assessment done with my own weaknesses, muscle weaknesses and imbalances and stuff like that, and try and get those sorted out.
Matt, certainly, mate. Happy to help, and if any of the listeners, have any questions, then I'm happy to help. Just throw them across on social media, the running.physio Facebook community. I'm regularly answering questions on there, sharing knowledge and information. So, mate, thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. I've done a few podcasts in recent months, talking about the book and its concepts, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you. I think got some really good insights there, and also all the best with your running goals and your and your podcast going forwards.
Yeah, cheers. All right, well, I'll let you go. You've got a 1 month old to attend to. It's about 10:30 p.m.
Yeah.
So your shift is just starting. Probably doing the night shift.
Mate, yeah, there might be a long night ahead, but thanks so much, mate.
Yeah, cool. Okay, cheers.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast at borntoKickArse.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating and a Kick Arse review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard and catch you next time.